Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Kenon A. Brown. I am an associate professor of public relations and the programming director for the Alabama program in sports communication. Thank you for joining us for this panel on athletes and social movements and social justice. I'm excited to have our group of panelists here today to speak on this topic. This is a part of our fall virtual speaker series, where we are having a series of live and pre-recorded Q&As, panels, and speaker sessions throughout the semester. And you can find those either at our website at apsc.ua.edu, or you can follow us on Twitter at Bamasportscom, that's with one M. To introduce the panelists, I'm going to start with Dr. Courtney M. Cox. She is an assistant professor at the University of Oregon in the Indigenous, Race, and Ethnic Studies Department. Her research examines labor, technology, identity, and globalization through sport. Before entering academia, she previously worked for ESPN, NPR affiliate KPCC in Pasadena, California, and with the Los Angeles Sparks. Dr. Cox, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Taurian C. Houston currently serves as the Associate Athletics Director for Compliance at Rice University in Houston, Texas. He oversees all areas of NCAA, Conference USA, and institutional compliance for the athletic department's 16 sports teams. An experienced professional within the college athletics industry, he has made career stops at Colgate University, Dartmouth College, and the NCAA National Office in Indianapolis. A former Division I track and field student athlete, he graduated from East Carolina University and later went on to receive his law degree from Charlotte School of Law. Mr. Houston, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Dr. Guy Harrison, he is in his first year as an assistant professor of journalism and electronic media at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. His research area is diversity and inclusion in sports media. He is also the author of On the Sidelines, Gender Neoliberalism and the American Female Sportscaster. Dr. Harrison, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And Dr. Mike Butterworth, he is the director of the Center for Sports Communication and Media, the Governor Ann W. Richards Chair for the Texas Program in Sports and Media, and professor in the Department of Communication Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. His research explores the connections between rhetoric, democracy, and sport, with particular interest in national identity, militarism, and public memory. He is the author of Baseball and Rhetorics of Purity, the National Pastime and American Identity During the War on Terror, co-author of Communication and Sports Surveying the Field, editor of Sport and Militarism, Contemporary Global Perspectives, and co-editor of Sport, Rhetoric, and Political Struggle. Dr. Butterworth, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Taylor Garner. She is a second-year master's student in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations, and she's going to kick this panel off with our first question. So, Taylor, I'm going to toss it right to you.
All right. So to get started, we've seen the embrace of social justice movements, not just by players, but leagues as well this year. This is a stark contrast to the response we saw when Colin Kaepernick first protested kneeling during the national anthem in 2016. So I have a simple question for you all. What has changed?
Well, I'll jump in, if I may, to offer at least one thing that's changed, and that is that the combined crises of having a global public health pandemic, along with the renewed attention on acts of violence and racial injustice, have converged in a unique way that have completely changed the landscape. And so we had a moment of open space in some ways without the games being played that allowed athletes to draw attention in completely different ways to these issues, which forced the leagues in many ways to respond. But I also think, and I know that others will want to elaborate on that, I also think that the pretext of having had the conversation in 2016 and beyond allowed for some changes that have occurred over time that it isn't just that we have the global health crisis right now, but we wouldn't be able to have this conversation right now had things not happened 4 years ago kind of set the stage for that in some ways.
Yeah, I think for me, what I think about is both what this contrast means and also being a contradiction. And one of the things I think if we take that 2016 to 2020 parallel, specifically thinking about Kaepernick, I think one of the things that's interesting, both in the NFL or even we can take it to the WNBA as well, is thinking about what it means to have, for example, even a couple years ago, Madden quote unquote accidentally bleeping out Kaepernick's name on Big Bank when Big Sean says Big Bank, when he says Colin Kaepernick on Big Bank, it's bleeped out in Madden. They say it's completely an accident. We just meant to remove him from the game, not the entire thing. And then we're here in Madden 21 where he now has a special entrance. Like he has this very kind of this way of, I don't know if they're thinking about it in terms of reparative justice via a video game or the ways that Roger Goodell is like, oh, we should have listened to Kaepernick. And I'm just thinking about in such a short time what that means. And I think it's everything that you said, Mike. I think it's very much in what happens when we all stop, when sports stops for a moment. What does it mean? What does that downtime mean for athletes? What does that downtime mean for people that are doing this kind of work all the time, year round? What does it mean that in 2016, the W players that were protesting when Alton Sterling, Philando Castile were murdered, what does that mean that now they want to put Black Lives Matter on the court, right, in Florida? So I'm thinking about what these contrasts mean, as well as like the ways that leagues and corporations have contradicted themselves previously and are now kind of circling back. That's a really interesting thing of what I think about right now.
Yeah, and just to follow up, Michael, as you kind of talked about, like living in that space, not having the, quote unquote, the distractions of a game. When we think about the abruptness of how fast things stopped, it wasn't something that was maybe a delayed, like, okay, well, this stopped and everything. Like I think about here in Texas, immediately the Houston Rodeo stopped. And if anybody knows about Texas and the Houston Rodeo, it's probably one of the, if not the largest economic driver of the city during the springtime period. And the fact that it stopped and people really had to force to address to say, hey, what's going on around me and in my, kind of your immediate circle. And then when you're realizing what happened with George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and the injustices that continue to happen one after another. And people, once again, were forced to pay attention. Like they couldn't turn their eyes towards things to say, okay, well, that's not my business. I have to focus on, my family, or, hey, there's, something going on as it relates to athletics, or there's a game going on. We have to address that. And, as you realize the platform that these athletes have in order to drive the message, and now owners are really looking at to say, wait, okay, there is no game for them to kind of put their mind back at ease or to step away from being dehumanized as only seeing as athletes. And now you see them as people first, and then recognizing that, hey, they're dealing with these issues or they have to carry this burden with them. And, that dynamic of, hey, shut up and dribble a ball. Well, there is no ball to dribble. So now if there's no ball to dribble and there's no activity for me to entertain you by, then you recognize me as a person first, and realizing that, my identity is tied more to some of the situations that we're seeing with George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and some of these other injustices that have happened prior to these individuals. And now, like you said, that kind of reparative justice saying, wait, this has been happening already. And recognizing that, okay, it's that spark plug of, because I don't have anything to turn away from or to kind of put the blinders on, I have to focus on it now.
Yeah, I think similarly, the fact that these leagues are starting up, and Mike kind of touched on this already, that they're starting up amidst the pandemic. The sports are already sort of, what's the right word I want to use here? They're already not top priority. We already know the seasons aren't what they would normally look like. There's already this conversation around all these sports about whether or not whoever wins a title will have an asterisk because these aren't under normal conditions. So taking that into consideration, I think it's a good time. Well, it's never a good time for anything like this, but it's prime time to put the focus on something else. We already know the basketball and the soccer and all the other sports going on aren't normal. So what does it matter if athletes and sports leagues take extra time to say, okay, we're going to focus on this right now? Because, in that respect, in terms of the integrity of the game, so to speak, they're not losing anything.
Okay, so tying into this, our next question, and Guy, I'm going to start with you first on this. How do the displays of protest that we're seeing from athletes currently, how do they compare or contrast to the displays that we've seen throughout the years? I'm particularly thinking about during the 60s and 70s at the height of the civil rights movement, during the Vietnam War. Try to kind of compare and contrast the protests historically that we saw during those times compared to what we're seeing now.
Yeah, I say this as someone who is not a historian, but I have to believe that the primary difference is the digital media culture we live in now compared to how things were in the 60s. I believe that the demonstrations travel so quickly. When Colin Kaepernick kneeled, we knew within moments that was going on. Someone took a picture of him on the sideline saying, "Hey, Colin Kaepernick's doing this," and it permeated throughout social media within moments. So to me, that's a big thing, and sports media consumers can act on that accordingly in a timely fashion.
Anybody else?
Again, not coming from.
Go right ahead.
Again, not coming from a historian background either, I think about it just from thinking about like a year like 1968, for example, that can be pinpointed as this pivotal moment in global history. I kind of think about like, what is 2020? How will I always think about it like how kids and grandkids and great grandkids of ours will be like, you were alive during 2020? Like, what a time, right? And so I think there's a way that 2020 will have that same resonance that people think about 1968 as both the convergence of a lot of different movements, moments globally in terms of what happens. And maybe also thinking back, even to the last question, why now, what this contrast means. There's a way that even in a very individualistic country like the United States, pandemic is hitting everyone across the board. Obviously, there are disparities across race, class, gender in a particular way, but there's a way that when you see one of your favorite NBA players has COVID, there's a way that when you see someone that you know really well, that's normally the most healthy person, the most fit person that you know, there's a way that this is making people think collectively, and perhaps that's why we're still struggling to get out of it as a very individualistic space, right? But there's a way that the collectivity of a global pandemic has also kind of brought about this collective space across, and social media is one way that happens instantaneous that's different. But I also think about sports specifically. There's a piece by Danny Chow in The Atlantic where he calls live sports an act of social imagination. And so for me, I'm trying to still think through what that means, but what the social imagination of live sport did in the 60s, for example, what it did in the 40s, for example, what does it do for us now in this way that we can both say, wow, this is making us aware of the difference in labor practices between, the UFC, where there aren't that unionization possibility, or the NCAA compared to an NBA, compared to a Major League Baseball. Where are these disparities even across thinking about professional sports? And so I think this time will be remembered in much the same way because of all of the instances, like, warfare does that in the 60s, but also what does that mean in terms of thinking about things like labor rights, of thinking about health, right? The way we think about the health disparities in this country and globally. And so I think this will be remembered like 68. We'll say, oh, where were you in 20? In a way that I think will be interesting, terrifying, and hopefully like a moment that we can look back and say, this is where we turn the tide, or we say, this is where we went even deeper, depending on what happens the rest of this year, obviously.
Yeah, I think a part of the comparison and the temptation to go back to 68 in particular, or maybe say 67 to 69, that time frame, is that we have such iconic athletes and moments that we can use as points of reference. So when the Kaepernick story broke in 2016, there were so many references back to either John Carlos and Tommy Smith in Mexico City, or to Ali, and the stakes were considerably higher for those athletes in the late 1960s. Which isn't to say at all that Colin Kaepernick hasn't suffered consequences of taking the stand that he has, but the degree to which those athletes in that era were reviled as a response is something that I think gets lost in a lot of the comparisons. There's so much romanticization of the activism of that generation that we have really washed away a lot of the pain and the challenges that came along with that. So you can almost predict how that cycle has already started to a degree with Kaepernick, and will definitely happen later, where we'll look back and say, wow, Colin Kaepernick was so courageous, and we're really proud to celebrate his legacy. But in the moment, that doesn't happen. And that's why there's so much frustration. You know, Courtney, you mentioned the NFL versus Madden, for example. So Kaepernick gets written back into Madden, but he's still not back into the league itself. And so there are all of these sorts of differences that I think are really important. We had such a perception that for so long athletes weren't interested in politics. They weren't interested in activism. And that was not entirely accurate, but largely that was the perception. So to have that resurgence, I think, does bring us back to that moment in some ways where we really view the late 60s, early 70s as the high point of social movement. So the comparison makes sense, but I think it's important for us to remember the differences too.
Nothing to add on my part. I'm not a historian or an academic. I just work at an academic inclined institution. That's all.
I understand. So let's talk specifically about the NBA's embrace of the Black Lives Matter movement. So based on your observations, what are the advantages and disadvantages of a sports league going all in on a cause like the NBA has done here? I don't know if Courtney, you want to start with this one?
Sure. I'm thinking about the advantages. Let's start with the good stuff. There's this heightened visibility, obviously, both in terms of how even those that aren't engaged with hearing athletes are still forced to watch highlights where they have these various things on the back of their jerseys, right? So there's this visibility that's unavoidable. You can't see a different kind of politicized version of an NBA highlight, right? There's a way that I think that both the bubble and the wubble have both done a really great job in assisting and not letting the moment go by the wayside. I think when I think about disadvantages, I'm thinking about, for me as someone that wasn't alive in '68, for me, it's a way for me to understand all of the issues, conflicts, contradictions that happen in movement. So if I am trying to make this comparison, again, not exactly linear, but the Olympic Project for Human Rights, understanding how women are left out of that, understanding how there are conflicting narratives and people have different ideas about whether or not to boycott or not. We get to see that in real time with what's happening with what's going on in the NBA, for example, in terms of players that are like, we want to play, players that are like, no, we should strike for the rest of the way. Even the usage of boycott versus strike. Right? There's also very important labor implications happening there. So for me, I think one of the disadvantages is when we tell everyone wear whatever you want on the back of your jersey, it dilutes a larger message. If I put peace or equality, there are these very politically safe things. And obviously Mike is the rhetorician, so he can break down exactly what's happening there. But to me, it's like the difference between the WNBA that says, here's our message, here's our stance. It's Breonna Taylor on the back of everyone's jersey. We are partnering with Kimberly Crenshaw with the Say Her Name campaign. They have a very clear, distinct stance that will carry them. Versus the NBA, I feel like there's a lot of conflict as to what people should do. And whenever we hear about these conference calls, we're kind of aware of like, there is not this one static way of understanding. Obviously, the Malcolm Jenkins thing in the NFL is like the equivalent of, we don't have all the same idea of how we get free, right? And so when I see that, I think there's a potential for us to have this lesson of the smoothing of the 60s, the smoothing of these narratives. We get to see in real time how we don't all agree. There's not this one monolithic way of protest, of activism, of Blackness, right? And then I felt excitement during the strike. I'm calling it a strike because it's their labor. And I felt excitement, and then it kind of quickly turned to disappointment. And I hated myself for getting so excited. And so for me, it's about what is this, the disadvantage is how do we sustain this? If there's all these individual efforts and there's not this collective momentum, what happens when there is a conflict on whether or not to play or not? What happens when we have to decide what the next step forward looks like?
I'll piggyback off of that with Courtney. So, in terms of like the disadvantages, I'll start there and then like work my way to the advantages. The big thing I always kind of saw when I was seeing some of these sport leagues go all in and, make these claims and do all these things. And like the quote that comes to mind always is, action without study is fatal. Study without action is futile. People who are quick to act but don't understand and aren't willing to take the time to understand what the true struggles are of a community and what we've been talking about, are quick to dilute and potentially destroy the true message and intention behind Black Lives Matter and some of these other movements. When I think about, Blackout Tuesday, everybody immediately, they're going to post a black photo and hashtag, but then didn't necessarily, when you ask somebody, hey, what does Blackout Tuesday refer to? Or what's the rationale or the message behind it? Everybody was very silent and was uneducated behind it. And I think that was, it was it destroyed, I don't want to say destroyed, I think it maybe dampened a moment where we could have really took some time to understand, like, this is what we mean by investing in Black businesses. This is what we mean by changing, hiring practices. This is what we mean by addressing the disparities between how, Serena Williams is portrayed in the media versus, a non-person of color is portrayed in the media, and really focusing on that, where we're very quick to react and say, hey, look at what we did. We did X, but didn't take the time to fully understand what people's struggles were. And then vice versa, if we just, focus on studying and just, I'm going to read up all these different things, but we never make the moment, or we take the step to really implement things, then all we did was, just educate, but we really didn't make an impact. And so I think that's why I see it sometimes as a disadvantage, where a lot of people wanted to do things and they did, but didn't truly understand where, like, yeah, it's a good, moment, but when we're trying to make real change and an impact, that requires more time and more intention behind your actions. As far as the advantages, I think one, it's, as Courtney also alluded to, it's bringing the focus. It's narrowing everything down to say, this is important to us. These things are important to us, and I'm not just going to, go away, or we're not going to treat this as a, hey, this was a really historical moment, and we kind of move on from it in order to get back with our lives. I think everybody talks about, I can't wait to get back to normal. Well, I don't think, that's gonna come if we're truly about making impact. It's gonna require change, and what is going to be normal is going to be, are we investing? Are we taking the time to address the biases and some of the inequities that have challenged people for several hundreds of years? It's going to take time, and it's going to be something that requires way more than just looking to put, names on the back of jerseys, or, putting things on NBA courts.
Yeah, I think overall, what I'm sensing and what I'm hearing is, going back to my answer to the previous question, that one of the issues is, I talked about how digital everything is now and how quickly word spreads. Well, you get what Taurian talked about in terms of people acting before actually thinking through everything. And that, spreads across social networking and social media as well. These leagues took action, and I'm thinking especially of the NHL. Their messaging was just really, frankly, bad. There wasn't a whole lot of thought put into it. It was hashtag We Skate For Racism, which they roped into all their other We Skate For campaigns, and it just wasn't a whole lot of thought put into it. So, if we had leagues that took this seriously and did this stuff around the clock, not just when there's a video of someone getting killed by police, then, there would be some action taken. But unfortunately, we don't have that yet.
Yeah, I'd add just a couple of things to all of that. And Courtney, I'm really glad you led with the WNBA in your response, because I think, obviously the NBA has a bigger footprint in sports media. And so that makes sense for us to start there. But they really are following the lead of the WNBA more so than the other way around. And so that's been really important. And Guy, the NHL hasn't messaged well, the fact that the NFL is going to put end racism in the end zone, and that's presumably going to be a sufficient message. And I think, one of the other examples that comes to mind here is just a couple of days ago, Naomi Osaka in the US Open is wearing a mask with the names of different victims that we have been learning about. And she was asked by Renee Stubbs on the post-match interview on ESPN, "Oh, we're excited to know who's going to be next," which completely misses and misunderstands the purpose of having those names shared. And Stubbs defended it by saying, "Well, I meant well. I think these are all well-intentioned." And so the point here, and I say this quite consciously, recognizing that I cannot identify with many of the experiences that we're talking about here directly from my own identity standpoint. It's a reminder of how important that is in sports media and in the way that we talk about these experiences. And so I do think what's been so valuable about the NBA and the WNBA is because those leagues are so visibly represented by Black athletes that we're hearing those voices and hearing those stories centered in a way that we haven't in some other cases. And that's influenced other leagues. And Major League Baseball was almost completely silent in 2016. And while they haven't been perfect as a league or individual teams or players here and now, they certainly are responsive to this conversation in completely different ways. And so I think those are really important influences too.
Right. Okay, so we've talked a lot today about professional sports, and we've talked a lot about really the Black Lives Matter movement, which is the primary social movement right now that's going on in sports. But and Taurian, I want to kind of start with you on this because there's a movement kind of bubbling up in the collegiate level right now, specifically in response to the challenges that student athletes have faced during the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's really more of a player movement about player rights as collegiate athletes. Obviously, this is a different situation than what professional athletes are facing, regarding the power and the authority that collegiate athletes have. What do you believe, just kind of really being, on the inside of this, what do you believe will be the long-term impact of this movement?
It's interesting. So I was having this conversation with our head football coach earlier this week because last week we actually had a player demonstration on our campus that was player led, and they reached out to not only myself as a Black male administrator, but our chief of police, our dean of students, in order to ensure that, hey, we want to do this, and this was not something influenced by the coach in any way, shape, or form. And our conversation with the head coaches, initially he asked to talk to me, and I'm thinking that, all right, then his first inclination is going to be, hey, how do I ensure like this doesn't impact the season, or how do I ensure like, hey, this doesn't disrupt how we move forward, because that's what you initially think. Coaches are focused on the season. And his response, or I was initially taken aback because his focus was on how do I recognize that this is going to be something that continues to permeate within the locker room, and me being a supporter of these agendas when they bring it forward to me now, and as recruits come into my program, and I need to be aware of these things as I'm speaking to them. And I think that was something completely profound on him, because he's recognizing that this is not going away. This is only going to be a continued conversation, because you think about it, as these young athletes are looking at these professionals and seeing of their influence of, all right, then they can I have the power to stop a basketball game. If I don't want to play, I don't have to play. And then thinking about like, how are they going to put my scholarship at risk, if I'm supposed to be supporting this institution. And the whole point of me being here as a student athlete is to ensure that I'm maintaining my status as a student and being of value to the institution, not as essentially as a commodity or a product. And I think that's something, it's almost an awakening of some of these young people on campus. And, I focus on football, but it's across all borders as it relates to student athletes. And it doesn't, it's not pinpointed on one particular subset of programs or individuals or even ethnic groups, because we certainly have those who don't look like us, who are very adamant about supporting Black Lives Matter and recognizing the injustices that are happening outside of campus. And so when I think about it in terms of, when we're thinking about these player rights, what do I have the right to do? How do I, what do I have the right to to speak out against? I think they are socially conscious of their power, But then even more so, they're taking the steps to educate themselves on, all right, as it relates to my scholarship, like what is my commitment to this institution and to this program? And they're recognizing that, all right, as long as I maintain the status quo as an athlete as it relates to my academics, and then, when looking at the team rules, they're really looking to get behind not only the fact of, hey, these agendas are important to me, and they were important to me before I became a student athlete here in your institution, and they're going to be important to me afterwards, and they need to be important to you if you're looking to recruit me to your institution. So when we're thinking about these rights of student athletes coming in terms of having that voice, it's something that they, going back to, when we think about name, image, and likeness, like that's something inherent to them as a person, and it shouldn't be something that's silenced that I have to forego for 3 or 4 years as a member of your program. I should still feel as if that, I can, understand the brand of your institution and represent that well, but still have my own voice and agenda. And as a coach, I don't need you to necessarily, be, right there with me hand in hand, but I need you to understand it. And so that when a donor, somebody who may not support it or tries to silence me, you need to understand my message and you need to understand my why and be able to articulate my why to those individuals.
If I could follow up on that, if only because the name, image, likeness conversation is only going to grow. And very recently, the University of Texas at Austin announced the new leverage program, which is designed to both leverage the existing brand equity of the Longhorn and UT athletics program, and then also allow students to have some degree of control over their name, image, and likeness. I think this is very much we'll have to wait and see how this plays out. It's very clear it's designed to be a recruitment tool, that it's added value, presumably, to a student athlete to come to the University of Texas, where we can help them build their brand identity. But it seems to me that that's going to pop open so many doors that we've yet to discover as this moves forward. And I do worry, all of the things we've been talking about here are under threat of being completely undermined by capital. So, the NFL didn't come around because Roger Goodell suddenly, found justice, but they came around because financial pressures. Ask Daniel Snyder about whether or not he really found justice with changing the Washington football team's name, or if it was the pressure from FedEx and others. So I do worry that the commercial interests of college sports will overwhelm this conversation. So it's less about athletes recognizing the sort of individual agency they have as citizens, and more about being able to maximize those commercial prospects, which I don't deny they should be able to do. So it's complicated. But I think the name, image, likeness conversation ultimately will maybe drive that even more.
Yeah, I think about that both in terms of also how athletes at the University of Texas and as well as USC are two that I'm the most familiar with, have actually been organizing and putting things to paper in terms of a list of demands. And so I think there's both the leverage thing is really interesting and important to think about how the university is going to try to flip it and say, look at all this agency that we give our athletes here. This is how we're going to make you better, versus what the athletes themselves are asking for. And the ways in which the university is like, yes, we believe Black Lives Matter, but we're still going to play the eyes of Texas, And so thinking about what this means in terms of what the limits of how much Black Lives Matter to these universities is really interesting. And thinking about even that downtime, what it meant for these college athletes that are constantly have these really tight schedules where they're constantly either practicing or performing, what it means when things stop for them, their ability to get on Zoom calls and organize, which is really at USC, I know, for sure that Anna Cockrell, one of the track and field athletes, she got a bunch of athletes on a call and said, what are we going to do? How can we organize? What do we need? And they formed an entire organization that's now an officially recognized organization at USC for Black student athletes. And so I'm thinking about what it means in terms of the potential for them to sit and say, well, what do we want? What should we have? We're being exploited in a particular way. how does this look for all of us, not just for Black student athletes, but what can we ask for that impacts everyone, whether you're playing a revenue or non-revenue generating sport? All of these things I think that they're thinking about in a more collective way. I'm thinking about that also even through, some of the athletes here at the University of Oregon partnering with this Pac-12 message that's on the Players Tribune. Again, this digital social media spread of this is we can see these demands that are asking for economic equity, racial equity, as well as health equity, and thinking about health insurance and thinking about how COVID's treated. And so I think the long-term impact of this is what starts at Missouri with football, what starts at Northwestern even before that with trying to unionize, name, image, likeness. The long-term impact of this is I feel universities and the NCAA are scared because the dissolution of the NCAA is feeling more real than it's ever felt for me. And so when everyone is like, okay, we'll give you these little things, and athletes are asking for more and more, I'm hoping they're able to push for what they need, as well as thinking about what this means in terms of the rights for all athletes, as all these athletes are also getting COVID, right? So what that means in terms of the precarity of their labor in this particular time, as well as what they're able to do collectively, I think is really impressive so far. And again, what that momentum looks like when everything does go back to normal, how are they going to sustain that is really like the concern I have, because I feel like this is such a rich, ripe moment for them. And I'm really impressed so far.
Yeah, I think the thing that will complicate that momentum and everything going forward is the geography of things, right? There's no mistake, or there's no coincidence that the Pac-12 was the most vocal this year. There's no coincidence, and I should say the student athletes in the Pac-12. There's no coincidence that the Pac-12 and the Big Ten were the two conferences that decided not to play football, right? And the SEC still is, at least among the Power Five, even though we know that there are smaller conferences playing. So, that's the challenge that student athletes will have that professional athletes don't have. The NCAA is not centralized. So, what student athletes do in one conference it will have an impact, but it won't be as impactful across the board as maybe you might see in professional sports. So that's the thing that I'm really curious to see. Which conference will be the first to say, will be the first to go all in on NIL, and then what's going to be the ramifications nationwide after that? How long is it going to take before the next conference acts? How long will it take for the SEC or the ACC to act among the Power Five? That's the thing I'm really curious about.
All right, and so my final question for you all, we've talked a lot about, teams and leagues embracing social justice movements and the NBA's impact. So what do you envision as the future for athletes being involved in these social justice movements, and how can we define success with these efforts? And Guy, I can start with this one on you.
Well, I think the easy question to answer there is, how do they define success? And that would just be action. I think that's ultimately what everyone is looking for. I shouldn't say everyone, but the athletes who are speaking up are looking for action, whether that's legislative action, whether that's corporate action. That's ultimately what everyone wants. So, the thing though is, and Courtney has touched on this many times, is you can't necessarily separate that action from the ramifications of labor, because a lot of this is what they're pursuing in terms of action. Labor will dictate how much power they have in terms of asking and seeking for that action.
Yeah, I think for me, I think it's really hard to define success. We don't know ever when one action that may be seen as a failure or seen as not going to its full fruition can later inspire someone else to do something else. And so I kind of, in my most optimistic, say that even when these small pieces feel like they weren't successful or don't hold that same collective momentum we all might hope, I think it also shows someone else like, oh, we actually have the power to do this thing. We should push for this now, right? And so as someone that didn't think that the Washington football team would change their name in my lifetime, I'm now inspired of saying like, okay, we saw this. What else should we ask for? What else should we do? What should we be doing? And I think success for me is also allyship. There's a way that for me, it's really difficult when I see the various ways that Black athletes are being called to action in ways that their non-Black peers are not. And again, I'll bring my WNBA example in because I feel like that is the truest example I've seen of solidarity and allyship in terms of what teams do together. It's not this, well, the Black players are going to take a knee or we'll just do this. It's like everyone together, everyone is posting, everyone is speaking out, everyone's having that. So I think when I see Breanna Stewart going just as hard as Laisha Clarendon, I'm like, okay, so we're all in on this. When they have a vigil, it's not just the Black athletes. And so I really want to see that kind of action in terms of sports media. The questions that they ask to Black athletes, I think they should ask to their non-Black peers, right? So I think allyship is one way I view success, as doing this all together. And that's how we build also collective momentum, I think, as well. And then lastly, I'm challenged in my own kind of perspective, and all of us, like being at universities, what our role is to support athletes, to support students in general at universities that are engaging in activism maybe for the first time or coming into some form of consciousness and figuring out where to go next. And so again, the Kimberly Crenshaw campaign to me was inspiring to think about what the role academics have, advocates for college athletes, what our role is in this space, in this movement, to both support and figure out our role, to let them, of course, build their own systems and momentums that they want, but also, we're close enough to it that I think that for me, success is figuring out what my role is in terms of being a support, a resource. If someone's like, I don't know the difference between a boycott and a strike, how should we write this? Like being that person that can be a resource. And so I'm challenged to figure out what my role is in making this successful as well.
I think all the comments so far really point to the fact that success isn't a singularly defined concept. And part of the problem and challenge with it is that it almost by definition forces us to think of things as being transactional. So we can only understand activism or protest as being successful if there is a defined and tangible outcome that we can see in the short term. So we think back to the emergence of Black Lives Matter in 2016, a lot of the accusations against it were that it didn't have any leadership, it didn't have any demands, it wasn't centralized. What do they want? Which missed a lot of the point of what was happening. But again, that context, that groundwork is so central for what we're seeing in the here and now. And so that's a much more prolonged sense of what success might look like. And as a rhetorician, I'm much less interested in direct cause and effect. I'm more interested in how spaces become available, how communities are shaped, how mythologies are created over time. The other quick thing I wanted to just respond to Courtney, your comment about allyship and solidarity. And I think going back to the WNBA makes a lot of sense there. And I think in many cases, it is women athletes who have a better conception of allyship and solidarity. That doesn't suggest that there aren't men athletes who are also expressing that, but I think that invites us to ask why that is, and ask what kind of power differentials we're exploring that aren't just about race, but also are embedded into the way we think about sports in this country and sports media, and to weaken and destabilize some of those power imbalances as well. I think that also defines success for us.
Yeah, and just to add to that, like you said, Michael, like it shouldn't be seen as this end goal in terms of success. It should be these continued steps and actions, as we've all alluded to, that we make each and every day that we're working and that athletes are doing. In terms of additional success, like from a collegiate athletic space, I would see success kind of maybe in the immediate as empowerment of the student athletes, like they feel as if they have the ability to speak out. I think before, even myself as a student athlete, I was very much, okay, I'm here, I'm blessed to have this opportunity, I shouldn't blow it, versus saying, no, like, as a student athlete, I'm of value to the institution, or I can add value. And so I should be able to speak out against injustices when I see them. And I shouldn't feel as if that my status as a member of the team, because I'm an athlete, that immediately that's the social justice agenda of the team, or I feel as if I can't separate myself as an athlete in order to speak on this topic. But then I would also to Courtney's standpoint, education. As I think as myself as a part of the athletic department, I'm on a college campus, so I'm a part of higher education at the foundational level. So what are we doing in order to not only educate our student athletes, but then also our staff? Because we're realizing that these are the individuals, our coaches, our academic advisors, our trainers, like all these individuals who interact with our student athletes. What are we doing to educate them as it relates to some of these things that are inherent to our student athletes when they come into the institution? So one, we are not silencing their voices, and we're not combative in any way if we feel like we don't understand, like, well, why are they so adamant about this? And if we do our part to educate and empower, then the success of, all right, then these agendas hopefully over time will change that narrative to where we see progress as it relates to the things that we're seeing that are holding us back as a society.
Dr. Cox, Mr. Houston, Dr. Harrison, and Dr. Butterworth, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, your reflections, your perspectives on not just a timely topic, but a very important topic. Ms. Garner, thank you for helping me moderate the panel today. And our viewers, thank you for watching this video. Thank you for supporting the Alabama program in sports communication. If you want to see more videos like this, again, visit our website, apsc.ua.edu, or follow us on Twitter at Bamasportscom. That's with 1 M. Again, thank you very much for joining us. And we hope to still have your support later in this semester. So thank you.